orchid roots that spread out and make a mesh all the way around over a tree trunk, spread out as far and wide as they possibly can, and they tell us, squeeze them into tiny little pots. Really? When we can see how wide and far apart these roots are spreading from each other, why do we want to squeeze them into tiny little pots? There's certain reasons for this. So let's take a deeper look into the reasoning behind it and if there's any truth in it. Welcome to the Nature Company. If this is the kind of information you're interested in, please hit that subscribe button down below if you haven't already, and that notification bell to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. How on earth are all of these roots going to fit into a tiny little pot? Well, okay, this is a bit of an exaggeration. This is a miniature little pot just for drama's sake, and you'll wonder why these roots that are trying to get as much air as possible to expose themselves almost to as much light as possible want to be squeezed into a damp, dark, tiny little space to try and produce better orchids. Well, that's not quite the reasoning behind it, but we'll go into that now. When orchid growers say that you must cram your orchids into tiny little pots, doesn't necessarily mean tiny little pots. What it does mean is the size of pot with regards to the size of your plant. So some orchids particularly do better than others in smaller, tighter pots, and dendrobiums particularly do well in pots that are seemingly far too small for the size plant that they are. And we'll get into what it is about their roots that actually make them suitable to these smaller size pots. Other plants just run away from your small pots. They just say, okay, I like it out there more than I like it in the pot, so they'll just keep running, and you'll have to either transplant them into bigger pots more regularly or mount them. And here's another one of those dendrobiums in a very small pot for the size plant it is, but already now you can tell that it's starting to needing repotting because it's producing kikis all over it, and this is a sign that possibly the roots are struggling and the plant is looking for a new way to keep itself going without producing too many new growths. There are a couple in there, but not as many as what we would be expecting. So this definitely needs to be repotted, probably into a slightly larger pot. By that we're saying we're only going to put it up into one size larger. This is going to allow for just that little bit of extra space to allow for a few more years worth of growth. And then there's these oncidiums that just say, I don't care what pot you put me into, I'm just going to grow. And they'll just grow out and around and over your pot, and that's also okay. And I don't necessarily need to repot it into a bigger pot. I'm going to let it form its whole little ecosystem. I've put it into this basket now, and it will take over in and around this basket, producing a nice environment for itself. So there's one of the big problems with having orchids in small pots, is they get top heavy and they like to fall over. There are ways of getting around this by putting weight into the bottom of the pot, but often with dendrobiums, especially how tall they can get really top heavy quickly. So how can you overcome that? Well, one of the reasons that they do like these smaller pots is because they will allow air movement generally all the way through them, especially when you're using something like terracotta that does allow a certain amount of breathability. And in the smaller pot, it will allow for that gaseous exchange to take place right the way through without any stagnant air in the center. As your pots start getting larger, so you'll end up with more of a center space where the air can actually be stagnant, and that's not what we want for our orchids. That extra space inside can also hold too much moisture, which will then start to rot your roots. So no air movement and moisture retention for longer periods equals trouble. That's one of the main reasons that it is suggested go for smaller pots for your orchids. Also, another reason is the smaller your pot is, the more frequently you're going to need to repot, because generally we use a lot of organic media, a lot of bark, sphagnum moss, tree fern fiber, things like that that are going to decompose slowly and they're going to need to be replaced. The smaller your pot is, the less space your orchid has to grow before it outgrows the pot, the sooner you're going to have to repot it, and it doesn't allow your media to sour that much. Because we all know how bad rotting media can be for your orchids, that pH goes down, the acidity goes up, it stops the ability to absorb nutrients, all those terrible things, increases viability of pathogenic fungus and bacteria, and the story goes on. So already we have a few reasons why small pots are good. If you're wanting to overcome that problem with the top heaviness that especially dendrobiums will get when you're putting them to small pots, because they can be quite vigorous growers, is either weighting down the bottom of the pot or using broader, shallower pots that will then still allow for that good air movement straight through, allow for evaporation from the top off, which will allow not too much water to be sitting in the center of the media, because it's going to be evaporating out of a shallower container, and that will happen faster. So that will also give you a broader base to hold your plant from falling over with. Also things like hanging baskets, ideal because again, you get that air movement all the way through your plant all the time, which is what orchids really want. So if you're wanting to plant your plants up into bigger containers and not trying to squeeze them into tiny little pots, then you have to listen to just those few little rules, including bigger media or inorganic media that's not going to hold moisture. You want to be able to provide enough air gaps inside that media so that that drainage can happen quickly and not cause any further problems. One of the things that we use a lot when we go for larger pots is use these air pots. They allow for all that extra air movement in through the sides of the pot, and that will allow for the air to go straight in and get to those areas where it might be stagnant. And also we use a bigger media, and the bigger media will allow for bigger air gaps between it, and that will then allow the breezes and such to pass through and push out that stale air and bring fresh air in. It's things like these air pots, the bigger air gaps, and also with the bigger media, you're going to get better drainage. So you're not going to get water stagnating in the center of your pot as well. It will allow it to drain out freely. So it just seems awfully strange to us to think out on a tree, those roots are growing out as far as possible, spreading out into a large mesh and not clumping itself into a tight ball. And then we think, why we want to cram it into such a small pot. So what is going to happen often with the dendrobiums is their roots are going to form this whole root ball inside the pot. This is going to allow for the roots themselves to draw in moisture, but the balance of the water will then basically drain away completely, almost immediately. And that's pretty much what it's going to be doing on the trunks of the trees. As the water rushes off, as the rain comes and rushes down the trunk, it absorbs into those roots and the water runs straight past again. And as soon as the rain stops, the roots dry out. So it's going to give you a relatively similar idea, because you're not having water sitting in there because you've got such a large clump of roots there as it is, and there's no space for the water to sit. You are only going to start getting those problems when your root mass has become too tight, and then there can be no further air movement in it, and that's when you want to start your repotting again. So especially when your plant starts looking like this, you know there's a little bit of a problem with the roots. We can see how even the top of the roots are dying back and getting a bit mushy. You know, this needs to be repotted into the next size up. And if you're leaving your orchid for too long like this, you're probably going to have to do a lot of root trimming. And There's another reason that you don't want to put it into a great big giant pot. So you want to put it in a small enough pot that the roots can grow and stabilize the plant as quickly as possible. Remember, with all orchids, the essential parts are that aeration and the drainage. You want to make sure that there's enough air going around those roots so that they have all the oxygen and carbon dioxide that they need, as well as having enough moisture that's not sitting around them all the time, because that velamen sucks in that water so quickly. You want it to, the rest of it to drain away so it can't then start to rot, that velamen. And again, if it's in a small pot, especially if it's terracotta, not only are you getting the breathability, but you're getting the evaporation of the water out of the pot. So it's not going to keep too much moisture at the roots for too long. So when thinking about the advice of planting your orchid into the smallest possible pot, you're not really cramming the roots in. You're just giving it as small a space possible that is going to make sure that you transfer it as often as possible. So you're not getting any of those problems with the rotting media, the lack of drainage and lack of air movement. In a way, you're trying to mimic the environment the plant is going to get outside on the tree, inside in your house, where you're unable to just throw it onto the wall and spray the wall occasionally. You want to have it in something that's going to be maintainable. So rather have a smaller pot so you can have more orchids. And when it comes to the flowering, and they suggest the smaller the pot, the more flowers you're going to get. This, in a way, could be the result of providing a little bit of stress to the plant. When you're growing it in artificial conditions, you're probably keeping it in tip-top shape all the time, and it's got none of those external factors that are going to put pressure on the plant to make it feel like it's under stress, to really think that it needs to flower to be able to reproduce itself. So in a way, you could be looking at possibly that's the reasoning behind keeping it in a tight pot to make it flower better. It's one of the few stresses that it will get. Considering the plant's natural environment is also essential in providing it with the best pot. And for instance, Dendrobium kingianum, they often lithophytic, which means they grow on those rocks, and those roots are often squeezed in those tiny little gaps tight between the rocks. So you can see why they might appreciate a small pot as well. Just to recap quickly, the reasons that we're putting them into smaller pots is not to cram the roots in. It's more to allow for faster drainage and faster evaporation to take place from the pot. It's to allow air movement through and deeper into the pot, and it's to possibly cause a small stress on the orchid to help with the flowering. But don't get confused. Don't go trying to shove your pots, your orchids in as tightly as possible. If there's too many roots for the size of the pot, you will start causing problems for your plant. And don't be lazy like me. Remember, the smaller your pot is, the faster your orchid will outgrow the pot, the sooner you have to repot it, and the less problems you're going to have with rotting media. And Ed has put a lot of information down in that Buy Me a Coffee link with regards to orchids and orchid media. So please feel free to go have a look down there. And thank you for watching. If you found any of this information helpful, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button down below, and that notification bell, bing bong, to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. Help us grow as we help your orchids grow.